Database Technical Debt with Erik Darling.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies building mission-critical software systems. Quick announcement, we're in the second year of my Software Architect Forums. Signups for the next session are up on the website and also in the show notes here. And if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with other peer software architect leaders, just sign up at the link in the show notes. Also, we've launched a new software leadership forum for technical executives and managers, for managers that oversee custom software groups, all the way from direct manager up to CTOs, VPs of engineering. And so we've got two tracks, one for the direct engineering architect lead, very technical topics, and the other avenue for more managerial oversight topics. But either way, with the goal of equipping leaders to be absolutely amazing at empowering software teams and just doing a great job with custom software. So these are peer groups, and I've really enjoyed facilitating the really robust conversation. So we'd love for you to join, or maybe tell your boss about it and have them join. And for those looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. So today, we have a guest on the show, Erik Darling, and Erik essentially makes your database faster in exchange for money. He's a DBA, developer, and an architect with a track record of tackling even the most challenging of technical issues. He runs a SQL Server consulting and coaching practice, and in addition to that, He's passionate about blogging and training and contributing to open source projects that help with SQL Server troubleshooting. He's given a ton of public speaking engagements on the topic at conferences and events around the world, like PASS Summit and SQLBits and Redgate Summits, and the list goes on. But Erik, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Very good. Thank you so much for having me. Those forums sound great. I think I might need to join one of those myself.
Hey, glad to have you. The conversations are really great, and my job is easy because I kind of raise a topic that's relevant. We raised the CrowdStrike issue because it affected everybody, and just
right.
all of that experience and everyone analyzing or wrestling with a particular topic. It's a really robust conversation. I love learning from listening to all the experience.
Oh, no, totally. I find stuff like that great to participate in because I'm an independent consultant. So most of the time it's just me and my thoughts in the office all day. So anytime I can get exposure to other people who think about stuff, I'm like, wow, yeah, let's talk about things. So that's why I'm excited to be on this podcast, because otherwise it would have been a full day of me talking to myself.
Well, glad to have you. For the listeners that haven't seen you speak at a conference,
yes.
or your
you may have given them too high of hopes for how good I am speaking all the times.
I mean, you have and we'll include these links in the show notes. You have a massive amount of content on your YouTube channel and various places that we should, we'll link for the listeners to go check out. But before we jump into the technical debt topic, you've been doing this, database and custom software connecting to databases work for many years. Kind of rewind back in your career, some context for the listeners. What are the high points or the events that kind of led you into working on what you're working on today? How'd you get
here? It is the craziest story. And I used to actually maintain a website with a single blog post that had my career journey on it. But over the years, it just kind of felt less and less like an important thing. I watched the viewership on it kind of slowly trickle down to zero over the years. But I started off with SQL Server. I was working for a market research company. I was supervising this data processing department, And the whole thing with them was like at the time, there were these prescription by mail companies that would send out these like actual physical like mail pieces. They would go out to like users from for the PBM. They would mail the surveys back. The surveys had to be opened, sorted, then scanned, and then have all sorts of like stuff done on them to set them up for automated data analysis. That was stuff like flagging certain responses with different codes for things. So it was this crazy thing. But then like as I did that more and more, and I sort of left the team to do more and more of that like the manual labor stuff on their own, I started doing more of the data stuff. And one day I was working with something in Excel and I just couldn't get it right. It was miserable. It was probably a VLOOKUP or something, like something trivial that like if I had today's like YouTube walkthrough stuff, it would have been easy. But my boss said, "Hey, do it in SQL," and I was like, "What?" I had never done anything in SQL before.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like 5 minutes later, I get this email. It says, "Erik needs SSMS installed." And that just led to this whole weird path of like, here's a SQL server, here's a database, here's how to import an Excel file, here's what to do to do what the thing you were trying to do in Excel that you couldn't do very easily. And then I just started getting sort of more and more responsibility with that.
Mm-hmm.
At some point I was just really, I had like really gotten into, like the querying, like they had me start to write like reports and stuff off the, different things that market research companies capture. And I just got really into like querying, performance tuning stuff. I was reading a lot of blogs about it, and I was just like psyched on it. But they were not so psyched on it. Like they were just kind of like, like, man, you're getting a little over your head. And I was like, no, this is exactly what I want to do. So when I was like, hey, is there like a DBA type job that you like title you could give me so I can get out of like this data processing thing? They were like, no. So just like flat out no. So I started looking for DBA jobs. And thankfully, the sort of work that I was doing, and my passion for various performance tuning things led me to getting hired at Brennoser Unlimited. I worked there for somewhere but 4-ish years, something like that, before starting my own consultancy. But just doing all that stuff, I learned so much about performance, like not just performance, but like running a business, working with clients, stuff like that. That sort of set me up for success with the kind of work that I do now. So like those are like really like the kind of mile markers. Like one, needing SQL Server Management Studio installed, getting my first DBA job, getting my first consulting job with Brennoser Unlimited, and then starting my own business.
Nice. Well, you've gone super deep into SQL Server and databases. And
yes, probably too far.
No, the appropriate amount. I mean, with the growth of our industry, the industry actually needs more people who've gone as deep as you have just to cover the whole need.
Yeah,
but
it's rough out there.
And I think most of the listeners, I would guess, they're not full-time DBAs. They're developers trying to get things done,
Yep.
And they have to get the database to work like they want it to work, and have to learn enough about it to not get in trouble and to make solutions that get delivered. Now, over the last, I kind of was introduced to SQL Server in the late 90s, and I look back and for the purposes of custom software, there's a lot that stayed the same, and then there's certain things that have changed. But it kind of reminds me, if you were an electrician back in the late 1800s, there was argument over direct current or alternating current. And if you wired a building, I mean, there was no compatibility. Whereas if you're an electrician today, over the last 20 years, everything's standardized, the plugs. I mean, so much is standard. You don't have to argue or think about that. It's just like, hey, let's go. We know what we're doing. So over let's say the last 20 years on the SQL Server and just the database front, what are the things that you think, it's standardized and it's super, super stable. It was the same as it is 20 years ago. And what things like are really, really different over the last 20 years?
Sure. So the things that I think are completely stable with databases are the problems that you will have with databases. And I say that like, it sounds a little tongue in cheek, but really, like I would say like the majority of the engagements that I get into, I have to fix the same dozen or so problems that have crept in over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably like 20 to 25% where there's just something brand new and weird and just something like mind blowing going on. But most of the time, it's just, that the sort of evergreen type stuff that either, people were misinformed about when the application started 20 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
or it was something like, what's a good example? Uh, so like, you know, I think at one point Microsoft SQL Server did not have a date data type. And
Mm.
so everyone in the world wrote a scalar UDF that takes your date time data type, converts it to like a varchar 12,
Yeah.
and then returns the varchar 12 because that's enough space and like sort of formats it as like a human readable thing. Just returns like the date year month or what day year month or whatever. And that ended up in every single query, and that ended up in all the reporting queries. And it wasn't a big deal until a certain point where the perils of scalar UDF sort of started creeping in and making everything slow, and no one knew why, because for years everything was fine and like nothing changed. Why is this thing a big deal now? So there, I think really, um, when I look at SQL Server and when I look at a brand new SQL Server, for someone's like we're having performance problems, like I'm like my eyes are just peeled for like these core things that will come up each and every single time.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Got it. So I want to talk on the topic of technical debt, because you advised
Yes.
a lot of clients on technical debt. And of course, .NET developers have that as a part of the language of, oh, something I need to get back to. Yeah, I didn't do it. I didn't have time. And now I'm paying this tax in my code.
Yep.
How does that show up in a SQL Server database? What does that look like in that space?
So I think it's especially interesting for any developer that's using an ORM, because ORMs is a sort of that's just effectively another API for the database. Like a store, like I consider lots of things within SQL Server an API as well. Like I think stored procedures are an API. I think functions and views and all the other stuff are just APIs in the database. But it's especially interesting for database developers who strictly use ORMs and have that like persistent abstraction layer between them and the database, where like they have so little control over exactly how the query gets written, right? They're not actually usually sitting there like typing up a query to get data out,
Mm-hmm.
because they don't know SQL. They know how to form that query using their ORM. So like they get further and further removed. And I think the thing that gets missed a lot by developers who work that way is that you know uh, databases contain data, and queries are there to describe the data and the shape of the data you want to get out of the database. And then the database figures out the best way to get you that data. And a lot of the problems that I see with ORM queries, especially like Entity Framework or something, is that the queries they generate are so just absolutely massive and painful, then developers have no idea that that's what's coming out of what they're asking for. So like you crack open that Entity Framework query plan, and it starts with like select extent 4,250, and you're like, whoa, like what have you done?
Mm-hmm.
So there's I think like the big thing that I start seeing is that developers just generally have no idea what's happening once their code fires off to the database. They're not aware of the indexes that would that exist in the database, like beyond some stuff that maybe got set up to back like foreign keys that the code first database generation put together. They might not even know if their tables have clustered indexes on them, and they have surely no idea like what their query looks like when SQL Server finally sees it.
Mm-hmm.
So like for me, the technical debt begins with those abstraction layers, because those just pull people further and further away from the database. On the other hand, you have like the dedicated database developers who are working on usually not like a brand new SQL Server thing, because I don't see a lot of people with like brand new SQL servers that have problems because their database hasn't matured to the point where they're going to see the type of performance problems that you see when your database hits like the 100 gig, 500 gig, 1 terabyte plus mark.
Mm-hmm.
They're still pretty small. They're still pretty reasonable. You can do almost anything to them, and they're going to function just fine for a while.
Yeah.
So then you have the developers who work on these like legacy products that are 5, 10, 15 years old, and they have 5, 10, 15 years of people with varying querying styles and opinions on things that should be used, like temp tables versus table variables. You just see all the sort of bad idea gene stuff that was very common and popular, and that there was a lot of sort of not to overfeed a dead horse here with the word, but certain functions of SQL Server that there was a lot of misinformation about that back in the bad old days of blogging. And there's people who think that, oh, if I just rebuild the indexes every night, everything will be fine, and that's just really not the case.
So when someone is coming into a database, maybe that they didn't build, they inherited, it's been around for a long time, are there categories of things that they can look for that just maybe bright and shiny technical debt that are easy to spot?
Yes, absolutely. Microsoft has built many features / landmines into the product that have these bizarre performance repercussions that you would never see coming a mile away, and don't end up in the documentation anywhere. There's all sorts of things that I think getting away from like the ORM development side of it, because like I said, they just have so little control over what the query does that it's sort of hard to say, oh, your technical debt is here, because for them it's usually that the query that's being generated is bonkers and it's not their fault. And there's perhaps some mix of like the database just wasn't set up index wise to deal with whatever new questions they're asking it, which is another like thing that sometimes the developers don't have great control over. There's usually someone else who's might be responsible for that, or they might just be so just sort of like untrained in what good indexing looks like. It might be hard to say, oh yeah, just look for missing indexes, because geez,
yeah, what's missing?
Who knows what those who knows which ones you might hear about and which ones you might not hear about. So like focusing in on folks out there who might be, actually sitting down at a keyboard and, writing select in all caps and stuff like that. I think the things that you need to be on the lookout for are, it obviously starts like at the outermost layer, right? If you're thinking about, like if you're like the first outer layer of technical debt is, can this hardware even do it? And SQL Server will tell you a lot about if the hardware can even do it via weight stats. Analyzing weight stats is, by no means the terribly easy or approachable topic, but I think that is the first sign of like, technical debt from a hardware perspective. Then there's all sorts of stuff that can go wrong from a settings perspective. There are ways that, there are certainly things you can do with SQL Server to set it up for success. And a lot of those sometimes get missed. If you're using something in the cloud that's a managed sort of service type thing, where Microsoft does a lot, or whatever cloud provider does a lot of the work for you as far as the the settings and whatnot go, you'll probably do fine up to a point. But that's definitely another place to check if you are using a VM of your own, or if you're using anything else where you're more responsible for those sort of tasks. Those things can certainly make or break, not like probably not a single query, but definitely the workload as a whole. Beyond that, all the sort of weird feature creep stuff that can end up in a SQL Server database, full text indexes, service broker, just a million different like weirdo features that Microsoft sort of dropped this 75% done V1 version of, and then just like never put any more investment into it. Just like things are just you can find all sorts of just oddball stuff with those. But really, I think what it comes down to is, that when you're looking at a SQL Server database for the first time, it can be incredibly challenging to like figure out what the bottleneck is, B, figure out where it's coming from. Is the call coming from inside the house or not? And then C, figure out if it's not the hardware, if it's not the settings, like where in the queries and indexes all that stuff comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And so learning, some of the diagnostic views, and or even going out on the internet and finding some scripts that help you sort of gather that data and give you something to analyze can be absolutely invaluable. Even if you don't understand every single thing that they're saying, because a lot of it is kind of like hieroglyphics. Just like starting to dig a little bit deeper and starting to ask questions about what's going on, and starting to like help yourself understand what's happening in your database is great for unraveling that sort of like where the technical debt is. But for me, a lot of it really does come down to queries and indexes, and and spotting the problems in those is becomes easier with time, I promise. Especially if you spend some time dealing with query plans. So just look. I would say if I had to come up with a list of things that you could look for in your queries that are causing issues for you, it would be stuff like table variables, local variables. It would be stuff like writing non-sargable predicates, which is essentially like, you wrap a column in a built-in or user-defined function like is null, coalesce, like substring, left, right, replace, any of that stuff. Like looking for things like that and sort of training your eye to spot when those things are problems can really help you figure out like where your technical debt is. Because like I said, anytime you're working on a legacy product that's been around for a while, you can be absolutely sure that someone along the line like got some bad information and put that bad information in the database, and then that sort of became your database canon, right? Because one thing that I try to like get people on board with is that code is culture in your company. And as soon as you have some bad code, you start getting some bad culture in there, because almost no one has good T-SQL or SQL Server training when it comes to like writing queries. So what do? They look at a query that someone else wrote, assume that's the right way to do it, copy and paste that, and then all of a sudden you just carry that unfortunate genetic lineage on from query to query.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
Gotcha. So it sounds like most of the problems that you look for that we can classify as technical debt has crept in. It's been there for a long time, and it's taxing you over and over. Is performance related? Like when you ask what bad thing could happen as a result of it, it's performance is the big one, right? Or are there some others?
Well, I mean,
besides
yeah. So I
performance?
mean, like you were kind enough to say earlier, I will make your SQL Server faster in exchange for money.
Yeah.
So like most of my my consulting, I have some strange projects from time to time, but the majority of my work is all SQL Server performance tuning. Like how can we take this query that runs for 10 minutes or 10 seconds and make it run for like 1 second? Like how fast can we get this thing in a reasonable amount of time? What changes do we have to make to do that? So like really like the majority of the work that I do and the troubleshooting scripts that I write and contribute to, and the blogging that I do and the videos I record are all sort of focused in that specific domain, because that was a thing that like really called to me about databases. Some people, to this day still love taking backups and restoring backups and love setting up HADR and availability groups and whatever. Some people they really love that stuff and troubleshooting that stuff. Me, I'm almost clueless when it comes to those things. But you show me a query plan, some tables, I'm all over it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like there's a whole system administration side of SQL Server, and then there's the getting the actual schema coupled with the massive amount of data that's in that schema to operate as fast as it needs to for the software that's calling it to work.
Right. So if you allow me to polish some ivory for a moment here, what I'd say is that when you're designing a schema, the two things you need to think about are you should be querying data the way that it lives, and your data should live the way you query it. And by that I mean, if you have to do anything weird at query runtime in order to present data in a way that it's supposed to be presented, like if you have to split a CSV in the middle of your query from a column, or if you have to get a substring of a column in order to compare it to another column or anything like that, your data does not exist the way that you query it. Now, there are ways to fix stuff like that, of course, but like that's like the really real sort of like
Rule of thumb.
query data the way you store it and store data the way you query it.
Yeah.
Your schema and your indexes have to be set up to answer the questions your queries are asking. And if it's not set up that way, you're going to have a real hard time getting answers.
In other words, use more processing time to write the data and do it. If you need to transform it on the write, not transform it on the million of reads now that you have written.
Yep. I mean, just think like, if you have to like just the sort of silly example that I gave earlier, if you have to get a substring of one column, or if you have to like concatenate two columns together in order to join them to a table with another two columns, or with that data sitting in another column, if you have to do that every single time you're reading data, just pretend that you not only have to do that every single time you read the data, but for every single row that you read, you have to run something that gets the data out the way you want it before you can compare it to the other data that you want to compare it to. That's also got to do some weird thing to it. So, there's just far more penalty and overhead doing that on every single read than if you just do it on that one write.
Yeah, good point. And you mentioned user-defined functions or the built-in ones operating over a column. Like, I think I didn't know the order of operations that SQL Server went through when I was very young in my career, and that bit me. But now that I understand, sometimes you're going to run that user-defined function over every row before you get to the where clause, instead of just over the result of the where clause. That can make I learned that makes a huge difference.
Yeah. So, I think the way that my catchphrase for that is, now that we're back to polishing ivory here, is that anything you do that makes your job easier makes SQL Server's job harder. So, you take some cute shortcut with a scalar UDF and you put it in a where clause. SQL Server has to run that UDF for every row to compute a result and then compare it to whatever you're filtering on. Whereas if you do something on like a scalar operator, like like you just want to calculate like the hour difference between like today's date and 3 months ago, SQL Server does that once. So if you have a table with 1 million rows on it and you want to figure out if the cut off the time and just to compare the date and use a UDF for that, and you compare that to like today's date, SQL Server has to run that function for like 1 million rows now if your table has 1 million rows in it. And if you select 10,000 rows out, SQL Server would have to run that function 10,000 times to produce a result for every row. There are some advancements in SQL Server now, like with the scalar UDF inlining feature that can help with that, but it has so many restrictions and limitations on it that you can't count on it making every function better.
Yeah.
And the story just gets worse and worse if you go from just converting a date or something to actually like in your function reaching out to other tables and querying other data, because now it's like you're not just running that query once and hitting something. You're running that query once, and that function is running 10,000 times from your query and going to get that data. So like these problems just like compound themselves and make things just bad and worse the bigger your data gets.
Yeah. Well, speaking of big databases, Azure SQL's been around long enough to amass a good number of databases, and some people have put really big ones in there. But there's a lot of
some
companies,
of them are not even named AdventureWorks. It's amazing.
That's right. But there's a lot of companies that have put they're more manageable databases in Azure SQL, and their big honking one is still on a cluster in their own data center. What are your observations on like the big differences that teams need to watch out for, how Azure SQL may behave in a very materially different way than what they're used to just with their own cluster that they have set up?
Yeah, so I think the big thing with Azure SQL, or specifically Azure SQL DB, we'll leave managed instance out of it because you get a little bit more fine-grained control there. But Azure SQL DB is really Microsoft taking the car keys away from you. There are so many things that you no longer have access to. Even something as basic as like the cost threshold for parallelism setting, you don't have access to that in Azure SQL DB. So if that was like an important thing that was restricting part of your workload and like making things run like well and normal, so not every single query was getting a parallel plan and blowing your CPUs out, that's a big like missing piece of the puzzle. I think what you said is right, where you have some of the smaller, more manageable stuff that probably is less complicated, has fewer dependencies, and doesn't need as much TLC. That's real easy to put into Azure SQL DB. If you're starting a brand new application and you have no like DBAs around, and you're just like, please God, someone take backups and make sure this thing stays alive.
Mm-hmm.
Azure SQL DB is a great place to start an application like that. But the number of people who I can see take like a really just larger database that has had way more time like on-prem, the number of people who can take those databases and move them straight up to like a managed platform like that is almost zero. That's like the number of people who are like, well, we're going to convert the app to Postgres in 18 months. And you're like, no, you're not.
No, you're not.
Good luck. Okay. Sure, I've heard that one before. There are a couple of my clients have spent a lot of money on consultants just to ask the question, can we convert this to Postgres? And they, if it's an old application with a lot of like SQL Server dependencies, the answer is always no.
It's not worth it.
And this is after it's like months and millions of dollars to get this answer of no. I could have told you that for like $100.
Yeah. Right. So in the spectrum of set up VMs and your own SQL cluster that happens to be in the Azure data center to the managed instance to Azure SQL DB, are there, like, through your experience, have you figured out how to predict, what category a database is likely to land in?
Yeah. So, I mean, like the older a database is, the more likely it is that something like managed instance, where you still get more of a like on-prem SQL Server experience from, is probably your better bet. Like I said, brand new applications with Azure SQL to be fine, because if you never had the option to change something, you have to really build your application around the way that it currently works, right? You hit a no very early on in development, rather than like hitting a no when you try to get your app to run over there.
Mm-hmm.
So for like older databases, managed instance is usually something that is a little bit more approachable to those people, because you still get like SQL Server agent, you still get most of the settings. It's certainly an incomplete product in a lot of ways. Pretty expensive for a little kind of how incomplete it is at times. But I think that's if your desire is to move to something that is managed by Microsoft or with cloud services and stuff, managed instance for the older applications is probably where you're going to end up. That's not to say that everything is going to be compatible up there. There's certainly times when the VM up in Azure, or if I'm allowed to say AWS, I guess, I don't know. But
yeah, I mean, it runs SQL Server very well too.
That's true. I actually like Amazon RDS better than Azure SQL DB most of the time, because you have access to a few more things in there that Azure SQL DB cuts you off from.
So it's kind of like their layer over managed instance.
Right. Yeah.
They don't take as many keys away.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
You can still bless with their knobs on the radio and change the air conditioning, see what's in the glove box. But I think Amazon, I think generally, at least for RDS, if I had to compare that directly to Azure SQL DB, I would probably prefer RDS there, most of the time. I have had clients that were able to go from a pretty decently old legacy SQL Server application on-prem to Amazon RDS, where they couldn't go to Azure SQL DB for various reasons. So, if you're comparing cloud vendors, AWS might cost a little more because they get to fork over the licensing mool out of Microsoft. But sometimes if you want that fully managed experience, that's what you got to do.
But are there any facets of an older database that would like even make it difficult to move to Azure managed instance?
Probably not. I mean,
there's things like linked servers where if you might not have the latency that you want if your other linked server is way back in a different data center.
Yeah, honestly, I think the big thing with all the sort of like the pre-fee sort of managed service stuff is getting the hardware right.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those sort of pre-configured instance sizes just might not make sense for whatever hardware you actually need. I think one of the I mean, I consider it a failing, because like you lack this like basic configurability stuff. Like I remember the good old days of like going to the Dell website to pick out like an R whatever number for someone, and you could like pick the CPU, you could pick the memory, you just had to make sure you got your cores and sockets right so that you could have enough, put the memory in the right configuration. You had control over all that stuff. with the cloud, it's like, if you want more memory for your database workload, because database workloads are just memory pigs, they will take
Mm-hmm.
all the memory that you give them and more.
Yeah.
Like you have to turn that CPU knob up. And so you end up having to sometimes over provision for CPU. And like the memory optimized things help with that, but still like getting like, like with a general purpose one where you get 5 or 6 gigs per CPU versus like a memory optimized one where you get like 13, 14 gigs of CPU. That's better, but it's still not the kind of ratio that a lot of database workloads need. Most
Mm.
database workloads that I see are just terribly IO bound. They don't have enough memory to keep the data that people care about in the buffer pool. Queries are asking for big honking memory grants, which is knocking a bunch of data out of the buffer pool. So you end up with this like awful Ouroboros of just memory in, memory out. And a lot of the cloud instance sizes are like either have these like weird caps on them for the amount of memory you can have,
Mm-hmm.
or you can't get the amount of memory that you need without having way more CPUs than you'll ever actually use. So you end up paying these crazy bills for these gigantic instance sizes that like are really just like CPU heavy for no good reason.
So when does that make it a better decision to actually set up your own SQL cluster in Azure if all the rest of the system is in Azure as well?
Well, I mean, that's a funny. I feel like that's almost a trick question because
And
for
maybe
a
the
lot of
answer is
people,
no. It never makes sense to do that. Even with this tension, it never makes sense to do that. You're still getting a huge benefit with managed instance. Maybe that's the answer.
well, I mean, sure. So I think really what it comes down to is who you have working for you. If you have enough people with enough good technical background to do all this stuff in the background that like a managed instance would,
Mm-hmm.
where it's taking care of sort of the patching for you, it's taking care of the backups for you, it's taking care of the high availability for you.
Mm-hmm.
If you have enough people working for you that have enough brain power to do all that stuff and manage things well on their own, you don't really need that. You don't really need to pay the managed service tax on top of what you're paying your employees. Like, that's going to end up getting real expensive. And then if anything goes wrong, it's like, who do you call? It's like
Mm-hmm.
if Microsoft support, I don't know. Do you have a good support agreement? Like if you're not Walmart, you might have a bad time
Yeah.
getting the level of support that you want from that external provider. Whereas the people you have working for you, they can give you, like, you're paying them for that level
Right.
of
Right.
support on the spot, and they probably feel a lot more inclined to like hop to when the server goes down.
But if you have that staff, even the move to the cloud strategy is probably
Mhm.
not as attractive. There's so many companies that don't have
Yep.
that staff, and when
Yep.
certain things happen, they realize, man, it's hard to do it internally. Yes, if we go to the cloud, we just don't have to worry
Yep.
about that class of effectively a lot of system administration, right?
Sure. I mean, yeah, no, and it totally makes sense for some people. Even from the perspective of just like keeping staff, like you might have a great set of like, 6 to 12 people right now who do all this stuff for you and make it all make sense. But, 2 or 3 of them who like, are the really senior ones. If they walk out the door, they get a better offer, they get bored, they retire, they get hit
Mm-hmm.
by the lottery, that you might you might lose the ability to keep things as clearly up and running as you have today. So I think there are a lot of reasons why companies are looking for that, even if they do have that kind of staff and even that kind of like technical prowess hanging around today. Because who knows what kind of technical prowess you'll have tomorrow or a week or a month from now.
Yeah, for sure. And I think our industry, just in general, is now I don't have any actual studies on this, but it seems like we're really short-handed on
Yeah.
available experience
Hmm.
versus what's really needed.
Yep. The good news is this could apply to so many people that like no one will think I'm talking about them specifically. But I run into so many people who have senior in their title, or whatever level that makes them higher than everyone else in their title, and they don't know anything. Like I'm like, it's like I call them groundhog DBAs, where they've had the same year of experience over and over and over again. They've never
Mm-hmm.
really branched out. They've never gone beyond that. Usually through no fault of their own, they haven't really gone out and gotten any like SQL Server training. Everything has been on the job. They've just never had to do anything else in their job, so they just end up, I do the backups, I do the check DB, I do the maintenance, I patch the SQL Server, I run a query every once in a while to look for expensive queries and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And like they just don't really go out beyond those. And so uh, I think even if you're out there and you're like, yeah, I'm going to go hire a real senior person, you might never find them. You might never find them at the price that you want to find a real senior person at. You might you might most likely will end up settling for good enough at some point, and you could be real disappointed by good enough at some point.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I did see some numbers that showed that the average years of experience for a dedicated DBA is 15 years,
Mm-hmm.
and of course the average age of developers has been going down, down, down as the massive growth. So
Yeah, they're fetuses at this point.
Yeah, just to get the number of years under your belt to be really, really good at those hard database challenges. Again, the smaller databases, it's like they just work. There's but once you get that,
you have to try so hard to screw that up.
Yeah, 100 gig, 500 gig and up. Well, yeah. Now even to do a test cycle to find out if something that you tweaked had the good result, it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and it's not even just a matter of like, can I test this one thing? Like, do I have a dev server with like sort of equivalent hardware and a sort of equivalent data set that I can figure out if this is like just A/B test, is this change good or bad on? Never mind once you release that query into the wild, like what happens then? Like you go beyond just what you're talking, like never like companies, like what companies have teams of people that will set up like a dedicated like workload testing environment where they can like replay a whole workload that sort of gives you a better feel for if the change you made was just like good on its own or if it's like copacetic with the whole rest of the workload that you're running. That's the really, really challenging thing. I've only run into a few companies that had anything like that over the years, and they had a team of like a dozen or so people that were all just working on the load testing environment and the load testing setup and being able to replay stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So like the number of companies I think they could like feasibly do that I'm going to say at scale.
Yeah.
But the number of companies that could feasibly do that is so small.
Right. Well,
and there's no good tooling for it.
As we close up here, I just want to kind of leave the listeners, if there is some slam dunk solutions, there's all these university programs for computer science and engineering and computer information systems, and so much of the education system has been focused on cranking out coders. Are there any really that you're aware of really, really good DBA training avenues that people could look up and dive into if they're listening to this podcast and realize, okay, yes, sure, I want to learn, I want to get better. What should I do? Where should I go?
So you've asked a great question. The first thing I'm going to do is give you the non-self-promotional one. If you're interested in databases in general, if you are just like, I want to deep dive on like databases, I want to learn as much as I can about them. A friend of mine named Andy Pavlo works at Carnegie Mellon University. He is their professor of databaseology. And Carnegie Mellon is cool because they let him record and put on YouTube for free all of his course lectures. You don't get like the test stuff, you don't get the test material, and he's not going to come grade you for watching YouTube videos. But like even me watching those videos, I'm impressed by the level of knowledge that he has, just like about database systems in general. So you can get great training there. If you have your heart set on SQL Server performance tuning, I have very affordable training for that in the SQL Server space. If you want that, I would say you would have a hard time doing better than what I got out there. For DBA training, it's a little tougher because not many people are out there teaching courses on like here's how you take the backups, here's how you restore the backups. Because in general, that stuff is very easily handled by like third-party tooling. Most big enterprises will have some sort of backup software that they prefer you use, where you just click a few buttons and stuff backs up and stuff restores. So from that perspective, I think that the training is probably of lower quality when you start getting into like basic DBA tasks. But a lot of that stuff is so easy anyway that you're not going to run into a lot of situations where you're going to have to do a really complicated backup or a really complicated restore. because most databases aren't set up that way. Most people said, I don't want backups and restores to be complicated, so I'm not going to overcomplicate files and file groups and all that other stuff.
Nice. Okay, so we'll definitely include the links to Andy Pavlo's courses at Carnegie Mellon. That's awesome. I see he's got courses
he's fantastic.
On like the relational model and data normalization to create schemas, and then of course on database storage.
He goes everywhere. It's amazing.
Yeah, and then
really
also
amazing stuff.
Your more personal one-on-one coaching, right?
Yes. That
awesome.
does exist. Even if it's not one-on-one coaching, if you need, help with SQL Server performance in any way, whether it's, health checks, hands-on tuning, dealing with emergencies, training developers so that you have fewer SQL Server emergencies, hands-on query and index tuning, stuff like that. Anything you need, I'm pretty well versed and ingrained in the SQL Server ecosystem for that.
Well, there's some listener out there that has currently a database on fire, so they're going to be calling.
Yes. And as always, my rates are reasonable.
Awesome. Well, Erik, hey, thanks so much for coming on and sharing with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, database technical debt and other things. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't know how much we talked about technical debt, but it was a good conversation.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course, you got it.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.